Scary Stories: The End of Infinity by username Cryptic Wonder. The
sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken.
It was getting late in the evening, that part of dusk where the last hangnail of sun gets swallowed by the night, fading into perfect darkness. The stars begin to appear across the sky, twinkling their cosmic beauty over all the people down below as they run through the streets for their lives. Jasmine stood in awe as both the moon and sun fell to earth in the garden of a small city. Their cryptic smiles shone upon the stampede that rushed by, as if sharing a private joke with one another that only they were privy to. Jasmine ran through the crowd as they tore their way in every direction, threatening to sweep her off her feet and trample her without so much as second thought. Most of the buildings that still stood were covered in flames that quickly spread to those that weren't. She ran over to one of the buildings that still stood and went up the wooden steps. The door was unlocked and she threw herself in, slamming it shut behind her. She lay against it, breathing heavily while wiping the sweat from her face. She was surprised to see her family. Her older sister lay on the floor, much younger than she should have been, crying with her mother. Her father, who had died a grisly death from stomach cancer, worked an old television with a rotting hand, yelling "shit" as if he couldn't get anything else but static. If they noticed Jasmine, they didn't say. She was about to ask what was happening when the rumble began, soft at first, but then the windows started rattling. It grew until it shattered the glass, and anything that wasn't nailed down was toppled to the floor. Outside, a huge wall of flame stretched toward them, swallowing everybody on the street. Bright yellow filled the room as she backed up. Then the walls imploded. She felt her body disintegrate into nothing, then woke up. Jasmine's dreams were always wild, vivid and marvellous, her mother would say. The shock of them would always leave a big impression. But they were nothing new. Now in her 30s, she had them long enough to know they were inconsequential, like watching a movie. The dark scene replayed in her head for about an hour or so, then faded into nothing. The world was going to end. She already knew that. It was only a month ago since the asteroid made the news. All across social media, the story of the asteroid heading towards Earth was all anyone could talk about. It was first played off, scientists and other officials assuring the public that it would only be a near miss, or that it couldn't possibly be big enough to do any real damage if it hit. She believed it, wanting desperately to believe it, as so many others did. The truth couldn't be denied, though. A few amateur observers saw the truth, and were heavily mocked for being conspiracy theorists and spreading misinformation. Others began to speak up, and soon NASA was even confirming it. The President of the United States convened with other world leaders, and they tried to destroy it with a large arsenal of nuclear warheads. The explosion could be seen from Earth, but it didn't even put a dent in the monster. The only thing they accomplished was possibly speeding up everybody's death, as radiation peppered back down across the globe. Soon enough, everybody was sick from radiation poisoning, and most of the wildlife withered. The final report that aired was a farewell message from the President of the United States. It more or less said, "So long, we had a good run, make peace with your loved ones and yourselves, because it was game over." The asteroid was supposed to be bigger than the one that killed the dinosaurs, and would probably destroy the Earth for good. The power cut out after that. 4 days left. Jasmine crossed the days off like a gruesome advent calendar. The 23rd circled in bright red. That was the day that the meteorite was supposed to destroy the world. It was visible during the day now, just a speck in the sky. She did her best to avoid the windows and direct sunlight, as it made the burns from her radiation sickness worse. But she made it a point to look at its progress each morning. Most of the people in her apartment complex were gone. It was the way she preferred it, as people usually lead to problems and disappointment. There was still a handful though, which she was thankful for, especially Chris. He was an older fellow who lived a few doors down. Even before the disaster, the two of them would get together once in a while for a game of cribbage. He was a sweet man, with a great sense of humour. Although she thought about romance with him once or twice, neither really wanted anything more than to skunk each other if they happened to be lucky enough that day. They would toss a few beers back while playing, and Bonnie, his German shepherd, would come by to give a lick to her hand, or see if Eva had a scrap of food to spare. There was a family of 3 that lived across the hall, close to the stairs, the Colemans. Edward and Michelle were a married couple that seemed to argue over everything. It was usually this arguing that would break Jasmine from her strange dreams. She felt bad for their son Nathan. He was a bright 9-year-old who always looked much sadder than a boy his age should. There was nobody his generational bracket around him anymore, and whenever his parents caught Jasmine trying to talk to him, they would hurry him inside while shooting her a dirty look. Old Mrs. Breyer lived next to the family. She was a quiet old woman that usually kept to herself. It seemed like everyone did these days. Chris once told her that both her husband and her kids died in a bad car accident. He was drinking and must have overcorrected, sending the car off a small cliff. She always blamed herself, and over the years her mind began to slip. There used to be a nurse that came by in the mornings and evenings. As the weeks went by, Jasmine could only assume that she was one of the people that left town. She wasn't sure why people left. Maybe they thought it couldn't get to them that far up, like some magical force would protect them from the fall of radioactive dust, or they could get just far enough away to be safe from the impact of the monster in the sky. It frustrated her, but she knew how powerful denial could be. After all, she denied her family most of her life. There wasn't much of a story there. Her parents split up when she and her sister were young, and neither wanted them. So, over time, while growing up with a foster family, she grew to resent them. Food was becoming scarce. Most of the places around them had already been looted, and stepping outside would mean drastically accelerating their sickness. So Jasmine, Chris and sweet Mrs. Breyer pulled what they had left and rationed it out each night. The Colemans, of course, snubbed their offer. When they finished a meal of buttered bread and chips, Jasmine made her way over to Chris's. Before long, she was losing her third game of cribbage against him, gently scratching Bonnie's tummy. Even the dog was in poor shape, as more patches of fur came off each day, exposing the bright pink skin below. You know, I kind of wish I had a gun, Chris said abruptly. Part of her wanted to be shocked, but she knew how much Bonnie meant to him. She must have been suffering so badly because of it. Yeah, I know what you mean. Such a cruel way to go out, for all of us. Baked to a crisp in our own skin, then BAM! Hit over the head by a giant rock. What would you have done differently if you knew what was coming? Would you have spent more time with your friends and your loved ones? Try and warn the government? Jasmine considered this while looking over her cards. She found it incredible that after all these years of playing, and with the apocalypse knocking at the door, that she could still get excited over a good hand, 3 5s and a jack. Then she scoffed, trying to push her sister from her mind. You got to have friends to spend time with, and family is a joke. Pretty much everyone I ever knew before moving here was already gone. That must have been hard. I suppose it helps in this case, though. Nobody to have to worry over. Yeah, I guess. Maybe I'll get loaded every night and eat until my ass jiggled. She laughed. Her smile turned into a frown when she saw the cut card was a 7. What would you do? Chris let out a sigh and put his finger over the top of his lip. He often did this when he was deep in thought. I suppose I would undo every tie I had ever had. Never would have gotten married or had kids. I also never would have gotten this mangy old mutt, he said, giving her ear a scratch. She wanted to argue for him, to show him the good in all of it, but there wasn't much point. He was effectively right. Either that, he spoke again, throwing 2 cards to her crib, or I've always wanted to fly someday. Take me and old Bonnie here across the city to a faraway place. He said this with a warm smile. As he pet Bonnie's head, more fur came away in his hands. Jasmine could see the pain in his eyes. It was heartbreaking. Well, we still got time. Maybe we should go to an airport and go for a ride, she said with a smirk. Chris chuckled, and they continued their game, Jasmine losing by 64 points. It was still early in the evening when Jasmine went home. She, along with everyone else it seemed, slept more these days. The sickness that ran its course took a lot of them out. Not that there was much else to do anyway. The water no longer worked, but was so contaminated that it would have been a death sentence to use. So, a shower was out of the question. She settled for just removing her clothes and flopping to the bed. She was close to drifting off too when she heard the angry screaming coming down from the hall. It was Mrs. Briar, frustrated. She threw her dirty, blood-spotted clothes back on and went out to the hall. The door to Mrs. Briar's apartment was wide open. She made her way over to it, then poked her head in. Mrs. Briar? She moved further inside, and was stunned to see a man she didn't recognise standing over the terrified old woman. The man had clearly been living outside the city. The skin on his face was mostly gone, only leaving a mask of brown, dried up, leathery meat. Jasmine wasn't even entirely sure if he could blink still. The tip of a long knife rested against the woman's red skin, and Jasmine began to backpedal. He was on her in a flash, squeezing a tight hand around the back of her neck. At this she jumped, yelping in both fear and pain. "No, please, what do you want?" "Water. You're gonna give me all of your goddamn water, or you are going to get this knife jammed into your face. Got that?" Jasmine nodded as his crazed eyes took her in. They were an ugly yellow, and the muscle that was still somehow managed to encase them was an angry shade of red that seemed to be slowly burning towards them. When he talked, she could see several teeth were missing. She thought of her own teeth that started to become loose last week, and it scared her. No one was going to be spared. You get me that water, all of it. I might just stab her just to put her out of her misery, he growled, pointing the blade to Mrs. Briar again. No, please, my apartment's this way, she yelled, pulling him back from his coat. You can take every bottle I have, okay? Nobody has to get hurt. She was crying, and amazed by it, after all this time, she still didn't want to die, or Mrs. Briar. He nodded at this, and the two slowly made their way back to Jasmine's door. As she walked through, a loud gasp shot out from behind her. She turned her head, and Chris was standing there holding a rolling pin that dripped with blood. The man lay on the floor, a nasty wound on the back of his scalp that leaked what little blood still pumped from inside his body. Please, I just need water. My daughter, her fever, gonna die. With a loud roar, he slammed the pin down on his skull again and again. No, Chris, she pleaded. You want this arsehole getting up again? Don't get suckered by him. He's desperate. There's no daughter. She turned away as he continued raining down blows. Sharp cracks turned into wet thumps until he was sure the man didn't feel a thing. Somewhere out there in the city, possibly the next building over, was a little girl who would die a sad death. She went into her apartment and locked the door, where she cried herself into a deep sleep. Jasmine was running down the street she grew up on. Ahead of her, a field of skeletons stood in all directions, all of them pointing towards her, jaws open in a noiseless scream. She took a quick look behind her to see a great ball of fire and smoke dropping from the sky. She ran faster as she felt the earth begin to shake. Then the behemoth touched down. Even as she continued to pump her legs, she was lifted up into the air along with the skeletons. Their screams became audible as they joined hers in a grim chorus. The first thing to hit her was the nausea. It quickly rose from the depths of her stomach and she retched up last night's meager meal. The next thing she noticed was how badly it hurt. It was as though she swallowed a glowing coal that made its permanent hole in her core. After a few more dry heaves, she was shocked to see how much blood was on the carpet. Her sickness was getting worse, and at this rate, the radiation might seal the deal before the asteroid. She groaned as she got out of bed. Everything hurt. The glistening blisters on her unnaturally red skin had gotten bigger. She stumbled out to the hall and was surprised that she didn't hear the Colemans. Maybe they finally worked it out last night, she decided. She was going towards Mrs. Briar's to see how she was holding up after last night. When the Coleman's door opened, Chris stepped out, looking surprised to see Jasmine. He was looking about as bad as she felt, as blood seemed to paint his arms and face. Chris, what's going on? What happened? He sighed deeply. It's the Colemans. They passed away last night. Jasmine's eyes widened at this. What? How? I knew they were sick, but all three in one night? It wasn't the radiation that got them. I think Edward must have finally given in to the futility of it all. And at some point he took a knife, stabbed Nate and Michelle, and then did himself in. She felt her tears well up, and brought her hands to her face. Chris walked over and put her arms around her. She took hold of him and sobbed quietly into his shoulder. As the moment ticked by, the door to Mrs. Briar's softly opened. She walked out wearing a robe covered in a mess of red and crept up behind him. Neither of them saw the knife lash out, the very same knife the man from last night dropped. With startling quickness for a woman her age, she dug the blade deep into his ribs, while raving like a banshee, twisting the blade back and forth. "You'll thank me later, dear," she said, nodding. Once again she reached back, and as the blade came forward, Jasmine shoved her against the guardrail of the steps. The once sweet old woman screamed as she tumbled down the stairs below. It would have been a relief if she died there, but she lay at the bottom, howling at the jagged piece of railing that pinned her to the 4th step up. Jasmine went to Chris, putting her hand in his wound. It was wide, and blood seemed to pour between her fingers. "Crazy bitch!" he yelled, as the two of them struggled to their feet. They made their way over to his apartment, and she sat him down on the table they played cards at so many times together. She rifled through his bathroom for first aid supplies, and came back with alcohol and gauze. As she poured the stinging liquid, he screamed so loud that made Bonnie howl in tandem. She hadn't seen Bonnie until now, and she really wished he hadn't. There was barely any fur on the poor animal, and bloody bits of her bowel trailed from her bottom. She wasn't going to last much longer. It was clear none of them were. She busied herself with Chris, and pressed the gauze firmly against his wound. Taping it up, she gave Chris a pathetic smile. "If you're done torturing me, I'll take my lollipop now." Jasmine giggled, despite her urge to cry. Tears burnt a lot more today, she noticed. "Fresh out, I'm afraid." "What a world! Suppose I settle for a beer then? There's only 2 left." She called from the kitchen. "I can go out and try and find more." "Well, ain't that a bitch? Nah, don't worry about it. Been meaning to quit drinking anyway, and this seems like as an opportunity as any. You can deal me in a game though." She quickly grabbed cards and set up the board. Then the two played cribbage for the rest of the day. That night, Jasmine stayed with Chris at his apartment. Mrs. Briar shouted off and on, but Jasmine couldn't bring herself to go out there. Before long, she was in a faraway land where everything appeared as a Renaissance painting. Men with shining armour rode upon mighty horses. They were off to slay some beast when up in the sky a large diamond star fell to earth. When it touched down upon the mottled ground, it sent men and horses alike off in every direction, setting them ablaze. Flames spread out and quickly ate through the picturesque setting, consuming everything until there was only darkness and the scent of death. When she opened her eyes, she felt her skin was wet and slick. Blood was now beading out of her wounds that grew upon her burning flesh, and the smell was putrid. She cried as she struggled to get to her feet and looked around. She didn't see Chris or Bonnie anywhere. A small trail of blood, most likely left by Bonnie, led out the door. She followed it to the hallway, noticing the smell of death was stronger out here. Mrs. Briar was silent, and would be forevermore. The trail of gore continued to the rooftop, and she opened the door where she saw the two sitting on the ledge. "Chris, what are you doing? Get back in here!" she yelled, knowing how much worse the levels of radiation were out in the open. He didn't respond, only waved a hand back toward her. She briefly considered going back in, but what was the point now? The pinprick in the sky was much larger now, like a small moon in the morning sky. The sunlight made her already fiery skin burn even hotter, but still she walked out toward her old friend. "Chris!" "Jasmine," he replied, half turning to her. "Oh my god, Chris," she cried. His exposed face and arms had the appearance of a rotting corpse. Nose, ears and lips were mostly gone, and as he tried in vain to pet his dog, it was obvious he was now blind. Bonnie was just as bad. How long have you been up here? We came out last night. Didn't think it would be this bad. Doesn't matter. We still get to fly at least once. He chuckled painfully. If you stay till the end, give the big rock a kick in the ass for me, hey? Before she had time to react, he leaned his ruined body forward and went off the side of the roof. He pulled Bonnie with him, and she heard the sickening thuds below. She couldn't bear to look, and she ran back to her apartment, now the only person left. Her condition was already bad, but the time she spent on the roof did her no favours. She slept it off and on the rest of the day, thinking about Chris. She thought about her neighbours, how she would never see anyone again. She thought about the man who would kill just to get his daughter some water. Then she thought about her own family. As much as she tried to block them out, she missed them deeply and wanted nothing more than to be with them one last time. Mercifully, no dreams haunted her that night. When she awoke on the final day, she had to unstick the blanket from her skin. A froth of blood and flesh coated her bedding, and her scream was weak as she sat up. Outside, the tempest of wind was savagely blowing, sending large pieces of debris through the city. The end was finally here, and she was alone. As she struggled to make her way to the hall, something in her stomach gave out. Blood began to seep down her legs, and she found she no longer had the ability to throw up. She continued her way to the rooftop, her wet, sticky feet slapping against the floor with each agonizing step. Throwing the door open, she was met with a grey, cloudy sky. The wind was of hurricane proportions, and off in the distant horizon, the great burning harbinger of death filled the sky, blocking out the sun. It was larger than she could have ever dreamed of, and so close she felt she could almost reach out and touch it. She shakily sat down on the ledge where she last talked to Chris. Jasmine wasn't going to take the easy way out. She spent too long fighting to give in to this monster. The wind grew ever stronger, but she sat there smiling, thinking of all the loved ones she would soon see again. The earth gave a teeth-jarring shake as it touched down. Light filled her vision as a great roar ripped away all sound. At least I won't be alone now, was her final thought before heading into oblivion.